After the divorce, my wife kicked me out and moved two lovers into my place. I went to use the old card my father left me, but the banker turned ghost white and screamed, "Sir, quickly, look at this!" My blood immediately ran cold when I discovered that, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is John, and at 56 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. Rock bottom isn't losing your job or facing financial ruin. Rock bottom is standing on your own front porch, suitcase in hand, watching your wife of 28 years laugh as two men carry your belongings to the curb." "Don't look so pathetic, John," Jessica said, her voice dripping with a cruelty I'd never heard before. She stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at 10 in the morning. Behind her I could see him, Marcus, her personal trainer who was young enough to be our son. He smirked at me over her shoulder, his muscled arms crossed like he owned the place. "Jessica, please," I said, my voice cracking in a way that made me hate myself. "We can work this out. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." She laughed, and the sound cut through me like broken glass. "Fix it? John, you still don't get it, do you?" She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Someone else. "There's nothing broken here except you. There never was anything to fix." 28 years of marriage. 28 years of believing we were building something together. I had worked 60-hour weeks at the manufacturing plant, saved every penny I could, skipped vacations and fancy dinners so we could pay off our mortgage early. I thought we were a team. "The house is mine, John," she continued, pulling a legal document from behind her back. "Daddy's lawyers made sure of that. You signed the papers yourself last month when you thought you were just updating our insurance beneficiaries." My stomach dropped as I recognized my own signature at the bottom of the page. She had tricked me into signing away my rights to our home, the place where we'd planned to grow old together. "You can't do this," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew she already had. A second man appeared behind Marcus. Tony, I think she'd called him. He was older than Marcus, maybe 40, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to work for anything real. He put his hand on Jessica's waist possessively, and she leaned into him like they'd been together for years. "Actually, she can," Tony said, his voice smooth and educated. "I should know. I'm the lawyer who drew up the papers." He smiled at me with perfect white teeth. "You might want to find somewhere else to be, John. We're expecting company later, and it might get loud." The humiliation burned through me like acid. Not only had she planned this betrayal, she'd recruited her lovers to participate in it. They were all standing there, watching me fall apart and enjoying every second of it. Where am I supposed to go? The words came out, broken and desperate. Jessica shrugged. "That's not my problem anymore. You're 56, John. Most men your age would have figured out how to take care of themselves by now." "I gave you everything," I said, hating how weak I sounded. "No," she said, her eyes cold as winter. "You gave me mediocrity. You gave me a life of settling for less. Did you really think I was going to spend my golden years stuck with someone who never had any ambition, someone who never wanted more than a paycheck and a mortgage payment?" The neighbors were watching now. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stood in her garden, pretending to tend her roses while she listened to every word. The Johnsons' teenage son was recording everything on his phone from their upstairs window. My humiliation was becoming neighborhood entertainment. "Please, Jessica. At least give me time to find somewhere to go." She checked her watch, the gold Rolex I'd saved 3 months to buy her for her 50th birthday. "You have until I finish my coffee. That's about 10 minutes. Marcus and Tony went back inside, leaving me standing there with my wife of nearly 3 decades. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe regret, maybe sympathy. But it was gone before I could be sure. "Why?" I asked. "After all these years, why now?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, and her words destroyed the last piece of hope I'd been clinging to. "Because I never loved you, John. I married you because I thought you'd amount to something. I thought you had potential. But you're exactly the same man you were at 28, just older and more tired." She paused, studying my face like she was memorizing my pain. "I wasted the best years of my life waiting for you to become someone worth being married to." The front door slammed shut, leaving me standing alone on the porch of the home we'd shared for 15 years. Inside, I could hear laughter, Jessica's laugh mixed with deeper, masculine voices. They were celebrating my destruction. I picked up my suitcase and walked to my truck, a 15-year-old Ford that I'd maintained myself because we'd been saving money for someday projects that would never happen now. My hands shook as I turned the key, and for a moment the engine wouldn't start. Even my truck seemed ready to abandon me. When it finally turned over, I sat there for a long time, trying to figure out where to go. I had $837 in my checking account, no credit cards that weren't maxed out, and no family except a sister in Oregon who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. That's when I remembered the envelope. It was sitting in my glove compartment where it had been for 15 years, yellowed and forgotten. My father had given it to me the day before he died, along with strict instructions not to open it unless I was truly desperate. At the time, I'd thought he was being dramatic. Dad had always been prone to grand gestures and mysterious statements that turned out to be nothing special. "When there's nowhere else to turn," he'd said, gripping my hand with fingers that were already growing cold. "When you feel like you've lost everything and there's no way forward, that's when you open this, Johnny. Not before." I'd been 28 then, married for less than a year, full of hope for the future. The idea that I might someday be truly desperate seemed impossible. Dad had been a simple man, a mechanic who fixed cars and lived in the same small house his entire adult life. What could he possibly leave me that would matter in a real crisis? Now, sitting in my truck while my wife entertained her lovers in what used to be our home, I finally understood what desperation felt like. I pulled the envelope from the glove compartment with trembling fingers. My name was written on the front in Dad's careful handwriting, along with a note, "For John, when all else fails." Inside was a single credit card, old and yellowed with age, and a slip of paper with a 4-digit number written in pencil. Nothing else. No explanation, no instructions, just a card that looked like it belonged in a museum and a PIN number. I almost threw it away. What good was an expired credit card from a dead man who'd barely made $20,000 a year? But I had nowhere else to go and no other options. The card felt strangely warm in my hand, and something about the way Dad had insisted I keep it safe made me hesitate. Maybe there was still a small balance on it. Maybe enough for a cheap motel room and a few meals while I figured out my next move. It wasn't much hope, but it was the only hope I had left. I started the truck and drove toward downtown, toward the First National Bank where Dad had done his banking for 40 years. If the card was worth anything, they'd know, and if it wasn't, well, at least I'd finally know that I'd truly lost everything. The shame followed me like a shadow as I drove through streets I'd known my entire life, past places where Jessica and I had made plans and shared dreams that had all been lies. Every red light felt like another moment to drown in the humiliation of being discarded like garbage by the woman I'd loved with everything I had. But something else was growing alongside the shame, a cold, hard anger that I'd never felt before. Not at Jessica exactly, though God knew she deserved it. At myself. For being so blind, so trusting, so pathetically grateful for scraps of affection from someone who'd been planning my destruction for God only knew how long. I pulled into the bank parking lot with Dad's ancient credit card burning a hole in my pocket, wondering if this final desperate gamble would save me or just provide one last humiliation to cap off the worst day of my life. The First National Bank looked exactly the same as it had when I was a kid accompanying Dad on his monthly banking trips. Same marble floors, same brass fixtures, same smell of old money and fresh paperwork. But walking through those glass doors felt different now, like I was entering enemy territory instead of a place where my family had been customers for decades. The young teller at the front desk barely looked up when I approached. Her name tag read Madison, and she couldn't have been older than 25. She was filing her nails, clearly annoyed at being interrupted by actual banking business. "I need to check the balance on this account," I said, sliding Dad's ancient credit card across the counter. Madison glanced at the card and frowned. "Sir, this card is really old. Are you sure it's still active?" "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "It belonged to my father. He passed away 15 years ago." She sighed like I'd asked her to solve calculus and reluctantly picked up the card, turning it over in her hands. "The numbers are barely visible. I'm not even sure our system can read something this old." "Could you try, please? It's important." Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she stopped filing her nails and actually looked at me for the first time. I probably looked as desperate as I felt, unshaven, wearing the same clothes I'd slept in, carrying everything I owned in a single suitcase. "Okay, let me see what I can do." She swiped the card through her reader. Nothing happened. She tried again, angling it differently. Still nothing. On the third try, her computer screen suddenly exploded with information, and her casual expression transformed into something between confusion and alarm. She said, her voice suddenly small. "Can you hold on just 1 second?" She didn't wait for my answer before hurrying away from her station, taking the card with her. I watched her approach the manager's desk, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never missed a meal in his life. She whispered something to him, showing him the card, and I saw his face go white. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. Together they hurried back toward me, the manager's face growing more panicked with each step. "Sir," he said, slightly out of breath, "could you please come with me? There's something we need to discuss privately." My stomach clenched. "Is there a problem?" "No, no problem at all," he said quickly. "My name is Robert Chen. I'm the branch manager. Could you please follow me to my office?" He led me across the lobby, past the regular customer service area, through a door marked Private Banking that I'd never noticed before. His office was twice the size of any office I'd ever been in, with leather chairs, a massive desk, and windows overlooking the city. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs. His hands were shaking slightly. "Can I get you coffee? Water? Anything? I just want to know if there's any money on my father's card." Mr. Chen sat behind his desk and stared at his computer screen like it might attack him. "Sir, before we proceed, I need to verify your identity. Can you please provide me with your full legal name and social security number?" I gave him the information, watching his face grow more incredulous as he typed. After several minutes of clicking and typing, he stopped and looked at me with something approaching awe. "Mr. Morrison," he said carefully, "how long has it been since you last accessed this account?" "I've never accessed it. Like I told the teller, it was my father's card. William Morrison. He died 15 years ago." "And you're his son? His only heir?" "Yes, why? What's wrong?" Mr. Chen took a deep breath and turned his computer screen toward me. "Sir, please look at this." What I saw made no sense. The screen showed an account summary with my father's name at the top, but the numbers couldn't be real. They had to be some kind of mistake. Available balance: $12,467,893.47. I blinked hard and looked again. The numbers didn't change. "This has to be an error," I said weakly. "I thought so too," Mr. Chen said. "That's why I've spent the last 10 minutes running verification checks. Mr. Morrison, this account has been accumulating interest and investment returns for 15 years. Your father set up what we call a dormant growth account with very specific instructions." My head was spinning. What kind of instructions? The account was designed to remain inactive until accessed by his heir, you, using this specific card and the PIN number he provided. During the dormant period, the principal amount was invested in a diversified portfolio managed by our private wealth division. "But my father was a mechanic," I said, still staring at the impossible numbers on the screen. "He lived in a 2-bedroom house. He drove a pickup truck that was older than I was." Where would he get $12 million? Mr. Chen's expression grew even more serious. Mr. Morrison, according to our records, your father initially deposited $800,000 when he opened this account 28 years ago. He made additional deposits totaling approximately $2.2 million over the following 13 years. That's impossible. My father never had that kind of money. Sir, Mr. Chen said gently, this account is connected to 17 different investment portfolios, 3 trust funds, and a network of international holdings. Your father wasn't just a mechanic. According to our records, he was one of the most successful private investors we've ever had as a client. I felt like I was drowning in information that couldn't possibly be true. You're telling me my father was secretly rich? Not just rich, sir. Your father was what we call a financial genius. Look at this. He turned the screen back toward himself and clicked through several pages. He bought Microsoft stock in 1986, Apple in 1997, Google in 2004, Amazon in 2001. Every major tech success story of the last 30 years he was invested in before anyone else. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I was hearing. But he lived like he was poor. We all lived like we were poor. According to his notes in our system, that was intentional. He believed that showing wealth would make his family a target. He wanted you to learn the value of hard work and self-reliance before you inherited anything. What notes? Mr. Chen clicked his mouse several more times, then began reading from the screen. Upon my death, this account and all associated holdings should remain dormant until my son John has experienced true hardship and genuine need. Only when he has lost everything and has nowhere else to turn should this inheritance be revealed to him. It is my hope that by then he will have learned the difference between want and need and will use this gift wisely. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father had known. Somehow he'd known that someday I'd be exactly where I was right now, desperate, betrayed, with nothing left but the clothes on my back and an old credit card. There's more, Mr. Chen said quietly. Mr. Morrison, your father left specific instructions about what should happen when you finally accessed this account. Would you like me to read them? I nodded, not trusting my voice to work. When my son finally comes to you, he will be broken. Help him understand that this money is not charity or luck, but the result of careful planning and sacrifice. Tell him that every dollar I earned, every stock I bought, every investment I made was done with love for him and hope for his future. Tell him that being poor taught me the value of wealth and being rich taught me the value of simplicity. Most importantly, tell him that this inheritance comes with only one condition, that he use it to build something real, something lasting, something that would make his old man proud. By the time Mr. Chen finished reading, my eyes were burning with tears I was too proud to let fall. My father, the man I'd thought was just a simple mechanic, had been planning for this moment for 30 years. Sir, Mr. Chen said softly, there's something else you need to know. This account has been monitored for any attempts at unauthorized access. According to our security logs, someone has been trying to find information about your inheritance for the past 10 years. My blood went cold. What do you mean? Multiple inquiries from someone claiming to be your wife, Jessica Morrison. She provided your social security number and personal information, insisting she had a right to know about family assets. We've been turning her away because your father's instructions were very specific. Only you, using this card with the PIN he provided, could access any information about this account. The betrayal hit me like a sledgehammer. Jessica had known. She'd known about my father's money for 10 years and had been trying to get her hands on it. That's why she'd married me. That's why she'd stayed with me through years of what she called my mediocrity. She hadn't been waiting for me to become someone worth loving. She'd been waiting for me to inherit money she thought she could take. The most recent inquiry was just last week, Mr. Chen continued. She seemed quite frustrated when we refused to provide any information. Last week? Just days before she'd thrown me out of the house I'd paid for, signed away by legal documents I'd been tricked into signing. She must have realized she was never going to access my father's money through normal channels, so she'd decided to destroy me completely and take what she could get. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that my father's inheritance would be something she could steal through divorce proceedings or legal manipulation. She had no idea that the old man she'd never respected had been 10 steps ahead of her from the very beginning. "Mr. Morrison," Mr. Chen said, pulling out a thick folder, "I need you to sign some paperwork to fully activate your access to these accounts. Once you do, you'll have complete control over $12,467,000, plus ongoing access to the investment portfolios that continue to generate returns." I stared at the signature lines, my hand trembling as I held the pen. Just this morning, I'd been a 56-year-old man with nothing but the clothes on my back, thrown away like garbage by a woman who'd never loved me. Now I was sitting in a private banking office, about to become one of the wealthiest men in the state. But more than the money, more than the security it represented, was the knowledge that my father had loved me enough to plan this moment. Every sacrifice he'd made, every dollar he'd saved, every investment he'd researched had been done with me in mind. Even in death, he was still taking care of his son. As I signed my name to activate the inheritance my father had spent a lifetime building, one thought burned clear and bright in my mind. Jessica was going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything she'd ever wanted. And unlike my father, I wasn't going to wait 30 years to make it happen. I spent 3 days in a hotel suite that cost more than I used to make in a month, trying to wrap my mind around the reality of my new situation. The Grandview Hotel's presidential suite felt like living inside a magazine, all marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But luxury couldn't silence the questions that kept me awake at night. How had my father accumulated millions while living like he barely had hundreds? Why had he kept it secret from everyone, including me? And most importantly, how long had Jessica known about the money she'd been trying to steal? Mr. Chen had given me a thick folder containing 15 years of account statements and investment records, but reading through them felt like learning about a stranger. The William Morrison in these documents bore no resemblance to the father I thought I knew. The man who'd raised me had worked 60-hour weeks at Murphy's Auto Repair, came home covered in grease every night, and clipped coupons to save 50 cents on groceries. This other William Morrison had been making stock trades worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, purchasing real estate across 3 states, and building an investment portfolio that would have impressed Wall Street professionals. On the 4th day, I decided I needed answers that no bank statement could provide. I drove to Murphy's Auto Repair, the shop where Dad had worked for 37 years until the day he died. The building looked smaller and more run down than I remembered, but old Murphy was still there, now in his 80s, still arguing with customers and fixing cars like he had something to prove. "Johnny Morrison," he said when he saw me walk through the bay doors. "Heard about you and Jessica. Sorry, son. Never did like that woman much." "Thanks, Mr. Murphy. Actually, I wanted to ask you about my dad." "Bill, hell of a man, your father. Best mechanic I ever had." Murphy wiped his hands on a greasy rag and studied my face. "You look like you got questions." "Did you know Dad had money? I mean real money." Murphy's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "What kind of money?" "The kind that would surprise you." The old man was quiet for a long moment, then gestured for me to follow him to his office, a cramped space filled with 30 years of automotive magazines and coffee stains. He closed the door behind us. "Your daddy swore me to secrecy," Murphy said finally, "but I guess that don't matter now, him being gone and all." He sat heavily in his chair. "Bill didn't just work here, Johnny. He owned 40% of this shop." I felt my knees go weak. "What?" "Been partners since 1978. I provided the location and the reputation. He provided the capital and the business sense. Every major decision we made together, every expansion, every equipment purchase, that was Bill's money making it happen. But he acted like an employee. That was his choice. Said he didn't want people treating him different, didn't want his family thinking money was the most important thing in life." Murphy pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses from his desk drawer. Your father was the smartest man I ever met, Johnny. Not book smart, life smart. He understood things about money that most people never figure out. Like what? Like the fact that having it changes you, but people knowing you have it changes them. Murphy poured 2 shots and pushed one toward me. Bill used to say that visible wealth made you a target for every con artist, gold digger, and lazy relative in the county, so he hid it. I downed the whiskey in one burning gulp. Did anyone else know? Your mother knew, God rest her soul. She was the only one until... Murphy hesitated. Until what? Until about 10 years ago when your wife started coming around asking questions. The alcohol turned to acid in my stomach. Jessica was here. Multiple times. First time she said she was planning a surprise party for your father's birthday and wanted to know about his work friends. Seemed innocent enough. But then she kept coming back, asking stranger questions. What kind of questions? About how much Bill made, whether he had any side businesses, if he ever talked about investments or savings, real pointed questions like she was fishing for something specific. Murphy leaned forward. The last time she came by, maybe 2 years ago, she flat out asked me if your father had ever mentioned leaving you an inheritance. My hands clenched into fists. What did you tell her? Told her to mind her own damn business. But Johnny, that woman was determined. She had this look in her eyes like a hunting dog that caught a scent. I left Murphy's shop with my head spinning and drove aimlessly through town, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. 10 years ago, Jessica had started her investigation. That was around the time she'd suddenly become more interested in our finances, more insistent that we update our wills and insurance policies. It was also when she'd started encouraging me to have a better relationship with my father. At the time, I'd thought she was being caring and thoughtful. Now I realized she'd been positioning herself to benefit from his death. My phone rang as I sat in the parking lot of the grocery store where Jessica and I used to shop together every Saturday. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Is this John Morrison? The voice was female, professional. Yes. My name is Linda Harrison. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by your father approximately 12 years ago to monitor certain situations. I think we need to talk. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from a woman in her 50s who looked like she could break someone's arm without messing up her hair. Linda Harrison had the kind of calm competence that comes from years of dealing with other people's secrets and lies. Your father hired me in 2012, she said, opening a thick file folder. He was concerned about some unusual behavior from your wife and wanted documentation of her activities. What kind of activities? Initially, adultery. He'd noticed Jessica making frequent trips to places she claimed to be shopping, but always came home empty-handed. He was worried she might be having an affair and that you'd be hurt financially in a divorce. Linda pulled out a series of photographs. Jessica entering a downtown hotel with a man I didn't recognize. Jessica at expensive restaurants with the same man. Jessica in what appeared to be very intimate conversations in various locations around the city. This went on for approximately 8 months, Linda continued. But what your father found most interesting wasn't the affair itself. It was what Jessica and her companion were discussing. She handed me a small recording device. Your father had me plant listening devices in Jessica's car during one of her shopping trips. What you're about to hear was recorded 3 years ago. I pressed play with trembling fingers. Jessica's voice came through clearly, along with a man's voice I didn't recognize. I'm telling you, Tony, there's money somewhere, big money. His father lives like a pauper, but I've seen things that don't add up. What kind of things? Bills getting paid that shouldn't be affordable on a mechanic's salary, property taxes on that house of theirs that should have bankrupted them years ago. And John mentioned once that his father helped him buy our house. But where would a car repair guy get $30,000? So what's your plan? I'm working on it. John's too trusting to ask the right questions, but I'm not. I've been to his father's work, tried the bank, even hired a lawyer to see if there are any public records. Something's there, Tony, I can feel it. And when you find it? Jessica's laugh was cold and calculating. When I find it, John becomes expendable. Linda stopped the recording and looked at me with something approaching sympathy. There's more, Mr. Morrison, much more. Over the next hour, she showed me evidence of a conspiracy that had been building for nearly a decade. Jessica hadn't just been unfaithful, she'd been systematically investigating my family's finances with the help of Tony Carlisle, a lawyer who specialized in asset recovery and divorce proceedings. They'd hired private investigators of their own to research my father's background. They'd contacted former employers, neighbors, anyone who might have information about hidden wealth. Jessica had even convinced me to sign papers that I thought were insurance updates, but were actually legal documents giving her power of attorney over certain assets if I became incapacitated. Your father discovered most of this about 3 years ago, Linda said. That's when he contacted me again and asked me to expand my investigation. Expand it how? He wanted to know everything about Jessica's background, her family, her finances, and especially her relationship with Mr. Carlisle. Linda pulled out another folder. What we found was very interesting. The documents she showed me painted a picture of Jessica that I'd never suspected. Before marrying me, she'd been briefly engaged to a man named Richard Sawyer, a wealthy businessman who'd broken off their engagement when he discovered she'd been stealing money from his accounts. No charges were filed, but the private settlement required Jessica to repay nearly $50,000 and agree never to contact him again. There's more, Linda said. After your father's death 15 years ago, Jessica hired 3 different lawyers to contest his will. All of them told her the same thing: your father had left no traceable assets and there was nothing to contest. But she kept looking. She never stopped. In fact, according to my sources, just last month she retained Mr. Carlisle to prepare divorce papers and a comprehensive asset search. They were planning to file for divorce and demand half of any inheritance you might eventually receive. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jessica hadn't thrown me out in a moment of anger or disappointment. She'd been planning this for months, maybe years. The humiliation, the timing, the way she'd already had Tony and Marcus ready to move in, it had all been carefully orchestrated. Mr. Morrison, Linda said quietly, your father left specific instructions about what should happen if Jessica ever tried to claim his inheritance. What instructions? She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. He said to give you this only after you'd learned the full truth about your wife's intentions. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my blood run cold. Johnny? If you're reading this, it means Jessica showed her true colors just like I thought she would. The money I left you isn't just an inheritance, son, it's ammunition. Use it wisely and remember what I always told you. The best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting even. Your loving father, Bill. Beneath his signature was an address I'd never seen before, along with a safety deposit box number and a key taped to the bottom of the page. As I sat in Linda Harriston's office, holding my father's final message, I finally understood the game Jessica had been playing. She'd spent 10 years positioning herself to steal an inheritance she thought would make her rich. She'd destroyed our marriage, humiliated me in front of our neighbors, and conspired with her lovers to leave me with nothing. But she'd made one critical error. She'd assumed my father was a simple man who'd leave behind a simple inheritance that could be stolen through legal manipulation and careful planning. She had no idea that the old mechanic she'd never bothered to respect had been playing chess while she was playing checkers. And now it was my move. The address my father had left led me to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people keep things they can't bear to throw away, but don't want cluttering their daily lives. Unit 47 was climate-controlled and larger than my first apartment, filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and a desk that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom. This was my father's secret office, the place where the mechanic became the investor, where William Morrison had built an empire while the world thought he was just fixing carburetors and changing oil. I spent 6 hours going through his files, and what I found changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the people I'd trusted most. Dad had kept meticulous records of every phone call Jessica had made to his workplace, every visit she'd paid to Murphy's shop, every attempt she'd made to access information about our family's finances. He'd documented her meetings with lawyers, private investigators, and financial consultants. He'd even somehow obtained copies of the divorce papers she'd had prepared 2 years ago, papers that demanded half of all assets, including anticipated inheritance from family members. But Jessica wasn't the only one who'd been hunting for my father's money. In a folder marked Family Concerns, I found a correspondence file that made my stomach turn. My sister Margaret, who lived in Oregon and who I'd barely spoken to in 5 years, had been in regular contact with Jessica for the past 8 years. They'd been coordinating their efforts to find Dad's hidden assets. The earliest letter was dated 3 months after Dad's funeral. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable. Jessica, I know you're as frustrated as I am about Dad's will. There's no way he lived that frugally and died with nothing to leave us. He was hiding money somewhere, and we need to work together to find it. John's too sentimental and trusting to ask the hard questions, but we're not. Their correspondence revealed a conspiracy that went far deeper than adultery or gold digging. Margaret had been providing Jessica with family information, childhood stories about Dad's habits, memories of him counting large amounts of cash when we were kids, details about his private conversations that only family would know. In exchange, Jessica had been funding Margaret's investigation efforts. I found bank records showing that Jessica had sent my sister nearly $25,000 over the past 5 years. Money that Margaret had used to hire genealogy researchers, private investigators, and legal consultants to trace Dad's financial history. They'd discovered that Dad owned property in Oregon under Margaret's current address. They'd found records of stock purchases made through brokerages in cities we'd visited during family vacations. They'd even located 3 banks where Dad had maintained accounts under variations of his name. But the most damning evidence was in a folder labeled Contingency Plans. Jessica and Margaret had prepared for multiple scenarios. If Dad's inheritance was discovered before his death, they planned to have him declared incompetent and take control as his caregivers. If the inheritance was revealed after his death, they intended to contest the will by claiming he'd been mentally ill and manipulated by outside influences, namely me. If those strategies failed, they had a backup plan that made my blood run cold. They intended to have me declared mentally unstable following Dad's death, using my grief and emotional state as evidence that I was unfit to manage large amounts of money. Margaret would step in as my next of kin and closest family member to manage the inheritance for my own protection. The final document in the folder was a letter dated just 3 weeks ago, written in Jessica's handwriting. Margaret, it's time to move forward with the final plan. John's becoming suspicious about the divorce papers, and I can't keep pretending much longer. I'm going to force him out of the house this week and let Tony move in officially. Once John's out and desperate, we'll push him toward a breakdown that gives you legal grounds to take control of any inheritance that surfaces. The house is already in my name thanks to those papers he signed, so he'll have nothing left but whatever Dad might have hidden. When that comes to light, you'll be there to help him manage it. I sat in that storage unit until well past midnight, reading through 15 years of documentation that painted a picture of betrayal so systematic and complete that it took my breath away. This wasn't a marriage that had gone bad or a family that had grown apart. This was a carefully orchestrated long-term fraud, and I had been the target from the very beginning. The next morning, I drove to the safety deposit box that Dad's key opened. The First National Bank's vault manager, a woman in her 60s who remembered my father, led me to box number 218 in the secured area of their basement. "Your father was very specific about this box," she said as she inserted her master key. "He left instructions that it should only be opened by you personally, and only after you'd inherited his primary accounts." Inside the box was another world of secrets that my father had hidden for decades. There were photographs of Jessica that I'd never seen before, surveillance pictures of her entering hotels, meeting with men I didn't recognize, and engaging in activities that clearly predated our marriage by several years. Some of the photos were time-stamped from our honeymoon period when I'd thought we were building a life together based on love and trust. There were legal documents showing that Jessica had tried to open credit accounts using my father's personal information, including his social security number and employment history. She'd been denied because Dad had placed fraud alerts on his credit file, but the attempts were documented. Most shocking were the recorded phone conversations. Dad had somehow obtained recordings of Jessica's phone calls with Margaret, with Tony Carlisle, and with other people I didn't recognize. The conversations spanned 8 years and revealed a level of manipulation and calculation that I'd never imagined possible. In one recording from 4 years ago, Jessica was talking to someone named Dr. Richards about prescription medications that could cause memory problems and confusion. She wanted to know about drugs that could be administered without the target's knowledge, substances that would make someone appear mentally incompetent without causing obvious physical symptoms. "I need something subtle," her voice said through the small speaker. "Something that would make an older man seem forgetful and disoriented, but not obviously poisoned. It's for a family situation. We're concerned about my father-in-law's mental state, and we want to document his decline for legal purposes." My father had been protecting himself from being drugged and manipulated by my own wife. Another recording, this one more recent, captured a conversation between Jessica and Margaret about the timing of Dad's death. "He's getting suspicious," Jessica said. "I think he knows we've been investigating his finances. Tony thinks we should speed up our timeline." "What does that mean?" Margaret's voice was fuzzy but audible. "It means we might need to help him along to his final reward. He's old, he's got heart problems, and accidents happen to elderly people all the time." My hands were shaking as I realized what they were discussing. My father hadn't died of natural causes 15 years ago. He'd died because Jessica and Margaret had decided he was more valuable dead than alive. The final item in the safety deposit box was a letter addressed to me, dated just 1 week before Dad's death. "Johnny. If you're reading this, it means they finally succeeded in killing me. I've known about Jessica's plan for 2 years, and I've been documenting everything. The evidence is all here, son. Jessica poisoned me, gradually with digitalis, a heart medication that's undetectable in normal doses but fatal when accumulated over time. Margaret provided her with the pills from her own prescription. They thought they were being clever, but old mechanics learned to spot poison just like they learned to spot bad oil. I could have stopped them, could have had them arrested, but then you never would have learned who they really were. You would have spent your life wondering if maybe I'd been wrong about Jessica, if maybe she really did love you and I'd been a paranoid old fool. This way you'll know the truth. You'll understand that the woman you married never loved you. She loved the idea of your inheritance. You'll understand that your sister sold you out for money she never deserved. And most importantly, you'll understand that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones you need to fear most. Use the evidence, son. Use the money and make them pay for what they took from both of us." I left the bank that afternoon with copies of everything. My father's final message burned into my memory in a rage burning in my chest that I'd never felt before. Jessica hadn't just betrayed me, she'd murdered my father and spent 15 years hunting for the wealth that would have been her reward. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd assumed that a simple mechanic wouldn't be smart enough to outthink her, that an old man would be an easy target for manipulation and murder. She had no idea that my father had spent the last 2 years of his life carefully documenting her crimes, building a case that would destroy her and everyone who'd helped her. Every phone call, every meeting, every illegal act had been recorded and preserved. Now I had $12 million, a complete record of their conspiracy, and legal evidence that my wife was a murderer who'd been planning to steal everything my father had worked to build. Jessica thought she'd gotten away with the perfect crime. She thought she'd successfully eliminated the old man and positioned herself to claim his fortune through marriage and manipulation. What she didn't know was that her perfect crime was about to become her perfect downfall. And this time I wasn't going to be the trusting, naive husband who signed papers without reading them. This time I was going to be my father's son. I spent 2 weeks planning my response, and every detail mattered. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice for my father and protection for any future victims of Jessica and Margaret's schemes. But more than anything, it was about making sure they faced the consequences of their choices without them ever seeing it coming. My first call was to Linda Harriston, the private investigator my father had trusted. She agreed to meet me at the storage unit where I showed her everything I'd discovered. "Mr. Morrison," she said after reviewing the evidence, "this is enough to put them both in prison for 25 years. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, identity theft. The district attorney would love this case." "I don't want them in prison," I said quietly. "Prison would be too easy. I want them to lose everything they care about, the same way they made my father lose his life and tried to make me lose my dignity." Linda studied my face for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" "I want them to destroy themselves. I want them to face the same desperation and humiliation they put me through, and I want them to know at the end exactly who brought them down." We spent 3 hours developing what Linda called surgical precision justice. Every move would be legal, documented, and devastating. Jessica and Margaret had spent years building their conspiracy. Now I was going to spend weeks dismantling their lives, piece by careful piece. Step 1 was financial strangulation. Through my father's inheritance, I had access to private investigators, forensic accountants, and legal resources that Jessica and Margaret couldn't imagine. Within 5 days, I had complete documentation of their financial lives going back 10 years. Jessica had been living far beyond our apparent means for years. The expensive clothes, the luxury spa treatments, the frequent shopping trips that never resulted in purchases. She'd been funding her lifestyle with credit cards and loans that she'd hidden from me. Her debt totaled nearly $87,000 across 11 different accounts. Margaret's situation was even worse. The money Jessica had sent her over the years hadn't gone toward investigating Dad's finances. It had gone toward gambling. My sister had a severe addiction to online poker and sports betting that had consumed every dollar she could access. She owed $43,000 to various creditors and was 3 months behind on her mortgage. Using my father's wealth, I quietly purchased their debts from the collection agencies and credit companies that held them. It took some negotiation and premium payments, but within 2 weeks I owned every dollar they owed to anyone. Then I called in all the debts at once. Jessica received a certified letter at the house she'd stolen from me, informing her that all of her outstanding balances were now due in full within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in immediate legal action, asset seizure, and credit destruction. Margaret received a similar letter at her address in Oregon, along with foreclosure papers for her house. Neither of them knew where the letters had come from. The collection notices were sent through a law firm that specialized in debt recovery, with no mention of my name or involvement. Step 2 was professional destruction. Jessica worked part-time as a real estate agent, a job she'd taken mainly for the social status and flexible schedule. Through Linda's investigation, I learned that Jessica had been using her access to client information for identity theft purposes. She'd been opening credit accounts using information from home buyers, then making small charges that would go unnoticed for months. I compiled evidence of her fraudulent activities and submitted an anonymous report to the State Licensing Board, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the real estate brokerage where she worked. Jessica lost her license, her job, and her professional reputation within 1 week. Margaret worked as a nurse in Oregon, a position that required a clean criminal background and financial responsibility. I sent evidence of her gambling addiction, debt problems, and conspiracy activities to the Oregon State Board of Nursing. They suspended her license pending a full investigation. Step 3 was social isolation. Using the recorded conversations my father had preserved, I had clear evidence of Jessica's affairs and her plans to defraud multiple people. I didn't release this information publicly. Instead, I sent carefully edited portions to specific individuals who needed to know the truth. Tony Carlisle, the lawyer who'd been helping Jessica plan my destruction, received copies of recordings where Jessica mocked his intelligence and discussed her plans to betray him once she'd gotten what she wanted. He immediately withdrew from all legal proceedings and terminated their relationship. Marcus, the personal trainer Jessica had moved into my house, received evidence that Jessica had been telling Tony she planned to get rid of Marcus as soon as the divorce was finalized. Marcus moved out that same day. The other men Jessica had been seeing received similar revelations about her true intentions and her financial desperation. Within a week, she was completely alone. Step 4 was legal exposure. I took copies of my father's evidence to the district attorney's office, but not to file charges. Instead, I requested that they open an investigation into Dad's death and preserve all evidence pending further developments. This created an official record and started a legal process that would make it impossible for Jessica and Margaret to disappear or destroy evidence. I also filed civil lawsuits against both of them for wrongful death, fraud, conspiracy, and theft. The lawsuits weren't designed to win money. I already had more money than I needed. They were designed to create public records that would follow Jessica and Margaret for the rest of their lives. By the end of the third week, the effects of my campaign were becoming visible. Jessica had lost her job, her lovers, her credit, and her legal support. The house she'd stolen from me was mortgaged beyond its value, and with her income gone, she couldn't make the payments. The credit card debt I'd called in was growing daily with interest and penalties. Margaret had lost her nursing license, her house, and her source of income. Her gambling addiction had been exposed to her employer, her neighbors, and her creditors. She was facing bankruptcy and homelessness. But I wasn't finished. The final phase of my plan required perfect timing and absolute precision. I waited until Jessica was at her lowest point, jobless, broke, abandoned by her lovers, facing financial ruin. Then I made a phone call I'd been planning for weeks. "Jessica," I said when she answered her phone. Her voice was hoarse, probably from crying. "John? John, thank God you called. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. There's been some terrible mistake, some kind of identity theft situation. Someone's been—" "I know exactly what's been happening, Jessica." Silence. "I know about Tony and Marcus. I know about the divorce papers you had prepared 2 years ago. I know about the money you sent to Margaret, and I know about the meetings with private investigators." Her breathing became shallow. "John, I can explain. I know about the digitalis you used to poison my father. I know about the plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. I know about the safety deposit box you've been trying to find, and I know about the storage unit where Dad kept his records." She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing becoming more rapid. "Most importantly, Jessica, I know about the $12,467,000 that Dad left me, the money you killed him trying to steal." The phone went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can. I have recordings of your phone conversations with Margaret. I have documentation of your attempts to access Dad's accounts. I have evidence of your fraud, your theft, and your conspiracy to commit murder." I paused, letting that sink in. "And I have something else, Jessica." "What?" "I have the power to make all of this go away." Another long silence. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to come to the house. My house that you stole. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Come alone. We're going to have a conversation about your future." "And if I don't come?" "Then the district attorney gets copies of everything tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and you spend the next 25 years in prison wondering what might have been different if you'd just been honest with the man who loved you." I hung up before she could respond. The next afternoon, I sat in the living room of the house I'd paid for, waiting for my wife to arrive for the last conversation we'd ever have. Through my father's planning and my own careful execution, I held every card in a game that Jessica thought she'd been winning. She had no idea that the desperate, humiliated man she'd thrown out 3 weeks ago had been replaced by someone with the resources, knowledge, and determination to give her exactly what she deserved. When the doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock, I was ready to show Jessica what it felt like to lose everything you'd ever wanted, everything you'd schemed to steal, and everything you'd killed to obtain. It was time for her to learn that some games have consequences that last a lifetime. I spent 3 weeks planning my response, and it wasn't driven by anger anymore. Anger was hot and reckless, and anger made mistakes. What I felt now was cold, calculated, and patient. The same methodical approach my father had used to build his fortune while keeping it hidden from predators like Jessica. My first move was to hire the best legal team money could buy. Not the small-town lawyers who handled divorces and property disputes, but the kind of attorneys who specialized in complex financial crimes and had connections with federal law enforcement agencies. The law firm of Whitman, Chen and Associates occupied 3 floors of the most expensive building downtown. Their conference room overlooked the city like a war room planning a siege, and that's exactly what it was. "Mr. Morrison," said Patricia Whitman, the senior partner who'd agreed to take my case personally, "what you've brought us represents one of the most comprehensive cases of conspiracy, fraud, and premeditated murder we've ever encountered. The evidence your father collected would be enough to send multiple people to federal prison for the rest of their lives." Around the conference table sat 5 attorneys, 2 forensic accountants, and a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator. They'd spent 2 weeks reviewing every document, every recording, and every piece of evidence Dad had left behind. "The digitalis poisoning is particularly damning," continued Dr. Martinez, a forensic specialist they'd brought in to review the medical evidence. "Your father was clever enough to save hair and nail clippings in the months before his death. The tissue samples show steadily increasing levels of digitalis over a 6-month period, exactly consistent with gradual poisoning." "Can we prove Jessica administered it?" I asked. "Between the pharmacy records showing Margaret's prescription filled more frequently than medically necessary, the recorded phone conversations about acquiring untraceable medications, and the tissue evidence, we have an ironclad case for first-degree murder," Patricia said. "But Mr. Morrison, prosecution is only one option. Given the scope of their conspiracy and the ongoing nature of their crimes, we can pursue several different strategies." She spread out a series of charts and timelines across the table. "Jessica and Margaret aren't just guilty of murdering your father. They've committed mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, attempted identity theft, and multiple counts of financial fraud. Margaret has been using falsified documents to claim ownership of properties that belong to your father's estate. Jessica has been living in a house that she obtained through forged signatures and fraud. What do you recommend?" "We destroy them systematically," said James Chen, Patricia's partner. "We use the civil courts to recover every penny they've stolen or fraudulently obtained. We use the criminal courts to ensure they spend the rest of their lives in prison, and we use the federal courts to make sure they never profit from their crimes in any way." Over the next hour, they outlined a strategy that was as thorough as it was devastating. "We would file criminal charges for my father's murder in 3 different jurisdictions, since parts of the conspiracy had taken place across state lines. We would pursue civil asset forfeiture to reclaim everything Jessica had obtained through fraud, including our house, her cars, and any other property purchased with stolen money. Most importantly, we would use the RICO statutes, laws originally designed to combat organized crime, to treat Jessica, Margaret, Tony Carlisle, and anyone else involved as members of a criminal enterprise. This would allow us to seize their assets, freeze their accounts, and hold them financially responsible for each other's crimes. The beauty of RICO," explained Sarah Kim, the former FBI agent, "is that once we establish the criminal enterprise, every member becomes liable for every crime committed by any other member. Jessica becomes responsible for Margaret's fraud in Oregon. Margaret becomes responsible for Jessica's murder of your father. Tony becomes responsible for all of it." "How long will this take?" "The criminal cases could take 2 to 3 years to fully resolve," Patricia said. "But the civil asset forfeiture can begin immediately. We can freeze their assets and seize their property within 72 hours of filing the paperwork." "And in the meantime?" Patricia smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "In the meantime, we make their lives as difficult as they've made yours." The next phase of the plan was more personal. While the lawyers handled the legal aspects, I had my own work to do. Jessica had built her conspiracy on the assumption that she was smarter than everyone around her, that she could manipulate and deceive without consequences. She'd gotten away with murder for 15 years because she thought no one would ever discover the truth. But she'd made one critical error. She'd underestimated my father, and now she was underestimating me. My first target was Tony Carlisle, the lawyer who'd been helping Jessica plan my destruction. According to Linda Harriston's investigation, Tony specialized in what he called lifestyle divorces, helping wealthy wives divorce their husbands while hiding assets and manipulating the legal system to maximize their settlements. What Tony didn't know was that several of his previous clients had been unhappy with his services, and one of them was willing to talk to investigators about his methods. With $12 million backing my legal team, it wasn't difficult to convince them to come forward. Within a week, we had testimony from 3 former clients who described how Tony had encouraged them to lie about domestic abuse, hide assets in offshore accounts, and forge documents to support their divorce claims. One woman had recorded her conversations with Tony, including detailed discussions about how to falsely accuse her husband of mental illness to gain control of his inheritance. The State Bar Association received a comprehensive complaint about Tony's conduct, supported by documented evidence of legal fraud and ethics violations. His law license was suspended pending investigation, and his bank accounts were frozen as part of a broader probe into his business practices. But the real blow came when we revealed that Tony had never been legally divorced from his first wife. His marriage to his current wife was invalid, which meant all of their jointly held property could be seized as proceeds from illegal activity. Suddenly, the man who'd been living in my house as Jessica's lover found himself homeless, bankrupt, and facing disbarment. Margaret was next, and her downfall was even more satisfying. My sister had been using falsified documents to claim ownership of property in Oregon that actually belonged to Dad's estate. She'd forged his signature on quitclaim deeds, filed false death certificates that misrepresented the value of his assets, and claimed she was his sole surviving heir in order to transfer property titles. But Dad had been smarter than both of us realized. Every piece of property Margaret thought she'd stolen was actually held in trust, with specific provisions that made her fraudulent claims automatically invalid. The moment we filed the estate paperwork in Oregon courts, her house, her car, and her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. The Oregon Attorney General's office was very interested in a case involving interstate fraud, forged federal documents, and conspiracy to commit murder. They assured us that Margaret would face federal charges in addition to state charges, with potential sentences that would keep her in prison well into her 80s. Within 3 weeks of activating my father's inheritance, Jessica's world was collapsing around her. Tony had been evicted from our house and was living in a motel, facing disbarment and federal fraud charges. Margaret had been arrested in Oregon and was sitting in jail unable to make bail since all her assets had been seized as proceeds from criminal activity. But Jessica still didn't know why everything was falling apart. She thought she was dealing with a series of unrelated legal problems, bad luck that would eventually resolve itself. She had no idea that her estranged husband had become the wealthiest man in the county, or that he possessed detailed evidence of every crime she'd committed over the past 15 years. That was about to change. I drove past our old house on a Thursday evening and saw Jessica's car in the driveway, along with a pickup truck I didn't recognize. Apparently, she'd already found a replacement for Tony, some new mark who didn't yet understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. I parked across the street and called the number I'd memorized 15 years ago, but never thought I'd use again. Jessica Morrison. Hello, Jessica. It's John. There was a long pause. John, where are you? I've been trying to reach you. The lie came so easily to her that I almost admired it. My phone records showed no calls from her number since the day she'd thrown me out. I'm in town. I thought we should talk. Of course. I've been so worried about you. This whole situation got out of hand, and I think there are things we need to discuss. I agree. There are definitely things we need to discuss. Can you come to the house? I'm here alone, and we could have some privacy. Another lie. I could see the shadow of her new boyfriend moving around in the kitchen. Actually, I'd prefer somewhere more neutral. How about Denny's on 5th Street? The one where we had our first date? That sounds perfect. When? How about right now? 20 minutes later, I sat in the same booth where Jessica and I had shared our first meal 29 years ago, back when I'd been young enough to believe that love was simple and trust was automatic. She arrived exactly on time, dressed in the kind of expensive outfit that should have been impossible on an unemployed woman's budget. She slid into the seat across from me, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of the woman I'd thought I'd married. Beautiful, confident, seemingly warm and caring. "John," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "I'm so glad you called. I've been hoping we could work this out." I didn't pull my hand away. "Work what out, Jessica?" "This whole misunderstanding. I know things got heated the other day, and I said some things I didn't mean. But we're adults, we're married, and I think we can find a way to move forward together." "Move forward?" "I've been thinking about what you said, about us building something together. Maybe it's time we looked at new opportunities, new ways to secure our future." She was already planning her next con, already working the angles to find out if I'd discovered any inheritance worth stealing. "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, I know this sounds morbid, but with your father gone all these years, there might be assets or accounts that we never properly investigated. Maybe it's time we hired a lawyer to look into the estate more thoroughly." I almost laughed. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still hunting for my father's money. She had no idea that she was sitting across from the heir to $12 million, trying to convince him to hire lawyers to find wealth that was already in his bank account. "That's an interesting idea," I said. "But Jessica, before we talk about the future, I think we need to discuss the past." Her smile flickered slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean Margaret, I mean Tony. I mean the $25,000 you've sent my sister over the past 5 years. I mean the digitalis you used to poison my father." The color drained from her face so fast that I thought she might faint. She pulled her hand away from mine like I'd suddenly caught fire. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jessica's eyes darted around the restaurant like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and her hands started trembling. "John, you're scaring me. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown." Even now, even caught red-handed, she was trying to manipulate me, trying to convince me that I was the problem, that my own perceptions couldn't be trusted. "The only breakdown happening here is yours, Jessica. Your conspiracy is finished. Tony's been disbarred and is facing federal charges. Margaret's in jail in Oregon, and you—" I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for murdering my father." She stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward, drawing stares from other customers. For a moment I thought she might run, but instead she leaned over the table, her face twisted with a rage and desperation I'd never seen before. "You can't prove anything," she hissed. "You're a pathetic 56-year-old man with nothing. No money, no job, no future. Nobody's going to believe anything you say." I smiled and pulled out my phone, showing her the bank app with my account balance displayed clearly on the screen. $12,467,893.47, I said quietly. "That's what my father left me, Jessica. That's what you killed him for, and that's what's going to destroy you." For the first time in 29 years, Jessica Morrison was completely speechless. Jessica looked like a ghost when I opened the door. Her expensive blonde highlights had grown out, revealing gray roots she'd never let show before. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple black dress that hung loosely on her frame. Most telling of all, she wasn't wearing makeup. Something I'd never seen in 28 years of marriage. "Hello, John," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside to let her enter the house she'd stolen from me, the house where she'd planned to live with her lovers while I rotted in poverty and despair. She moved through the living room like someone visiting a crime scene, touching familiar objects as if they might disappear. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the couch where we'd once watched movies together during happier times that I now knew had been completely fabricated. She sat on the edge of the cushions, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the coffee table we'd picked out together 15 years ago. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the inheritance? 3 weeks? About your conspiracy with Margaret? 2 weeks? About my father's murder?" I paused, watching her face carefully. "Long enough?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment I thought she might cry, but when she opened them again they were dry and resigned. "What happens now?" "That depends on you." I sat across from her in my father's old recliner, the chair where he'd taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with homework and shared the wisdom that had shaped the man I'd become. From this chair, I could see everything. Jessica's fear, her desperation, and the complete collapse of the facade she'd maintained for nearly 3 decades. "I have 2 offers for you," I said. "Choose carefully because you'll have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life." She looked up at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before, genuine fear mixed with the faint hope that maybe, somehow, she might survive this. "Option 1, I continued, "I give the district attorney everything, the recordings, the financial evidence, the documentation of your fraud and identity theft. You and Margaret both go to prison for murder, conspiracy, and theft. You lose everything, spend the next 25 years behind bars, and die knowing that you destroyed your life for money you never got to enjoy." Jessica's hands began to tremble. "And option 2? You disappear. You sign papers giving up any claim to this house, any claim to alimony or spousal support, any claim to anything I own or might inherit. You take nothing except the clothes on your back. You leave this town, this state, and you never contact me again. In exchange, I don't press charges." "What about Margaret?" "Margaret made her own choices. She'll face her own consequences." Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, calculating, trying to find some angle she could exploit. It was the same look she'd had when she thought I was signing insurance papers that were actually property transfers. "If I choose option 2, she said slowly, "how do I know you won't change your mind later? How do I know you won't decide to have me arrested anyway?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out an envelope containing documents I'd had prepared by the best lawyer my father's money could buy. "Because you're going to sign a confession, full admission of guilt for everything you've done. If you disappear and stay disappeared, the confession stays in my safe deposit box. If you ever try to contact me, come back to this town, or cause me any trouble whatsoever, the confession goes to the police, and you spend the rest of your life in prison." She took the papers with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold them. As she read through the confession, I watched 28 years of marriage crumble into dust. This wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. This was a stranger who'd been wearing my wife's face while she planned to destroy me. "There's something else," I said when she finished reading. "Margaret chose option 1. Jessica's head snapped up. "What?" "I called your sister yesterday, offered her the same deal I'm offering you. She decided to fight. She thinks she can beat the charges, thinks a jury will believe her story about being manipulated by you." I shrugged. Maybe she's right. Maybe she's wrong. But she made her choice. "You're lying. Check your phone. I believe Margaret tried to call you several times last night from the county jail." Jessica fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through missed calls. I watched her face crumble as she realized that her partner in conspiracy, her co-conspirator in murder, had been arrested and was probably already telling the authorities everything she knew. "She'll testify against me," Jessica whispered. "That's Margaret's choice. Your choice is simpler. Sign the papers and walk away, or join your sister in a federal prison." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. In that quiet, I thought about my father, about the years he'd spent protecting me from the truth about the woman I'd married. I thought about the love and trust I'd wasted on someone who'd been planning my destruction from the moment she said, "I do." But mostly I thought about the future, my future, free from the weight of their lies, free from the burden of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. "John," Jessica said finally, her voice breaking, "did you ever love me? Even a little bit?" The question hung in the air between us. For 28 years, I'd believed we were building something together. I'd worked extra hours to pay for her clothes, skipped vacations to save for our house, and planned a retirement we'd never share. I'd loved her with everything I had, but the woman I'd loved had never existed. "I loved who I thought you were," I said honestly. "I grieved for that woman when I found out the truth. But you, the real you, the woman who murdered my father and spent 10 years planning to steal his money, no, Jessica, I never loved you because I never knew you existed." She broke then, finally. 28 years of pretense collapsed into sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the life she'd built on lies, for the conspiracy that had failed, and for the future she'd lost when she chose greed over love. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, no regret, just an emptiness where 28 years of false emotion had finally been drained away. When she recovered enough to hold a pen, she signed the confession and the legal documents that severed every connection between us. She signed away her rights to the house, to alimony, to any claim on my inheritance or my future. She signed away 28 years of marriage as if they'd never happened. Because in any way that mattered, they hadn't. "Where will you go?" I asked as she prepared to leave. "I don't know," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have a sister in Florida who might let me stay with her for a while, if I tell her the right story." "Don't tell her any story," I said. "Tell her the truth. You might find it's easier to keep track of." Jessica walked to the front door, then turned back one last time. "John, I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I really am sorry." "No, you're not," I said quietly. "You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference." She left without another word, closing the door behind her with a soft click that echoed through the house like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. 6 months later, I was standing in the garden behind the house my father had secretly owned for 20 years, watching the sunrise through maple trees he'd planted the year I was born. The house was bigger than the one Jessica and I had shared, older but better maintained, with rooms full of furniture covered in white sheets and photographs of a family I was only now getting to know. Dad had left detailed instructions about this house too, along with letters explaining why he'd kept it secret, why he'd maintained our smaller home as a facade, and why he'd wanted me to discover this place only after I'd learned the truth about Jessica and Margaret. "This is your real inheritance, Johnny," his final letter had said. "Not the money, though that's nice to have. Not the investments, though they'll keep you comfortable. Your real inheritance is the knowledge that you come from people who work hard, plan carefully, and protect the people they love. Your real inheritance is freedom from people who would use you and then throw you away." The garden was exactly as he'd described it in his letters. Roses my mother had planted before she died, vegetables that grew wild now but still produced tomatoes and corn every summer, and a small bench where Dad had spent his evenings planning for a future he'd never lived to see. I sat on that bench every morning now, drinking coffee from a mug that had belonged to my grandfather, reading newspapers that told me about a world I was no longer afraid to be part of. Jessica's threats and manipulations seemed like memories from someone else's life. Margaret was serving 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy, murder, and fraud. Her gambling addiction had been exposed during the trial, along with evidence that she'd been skimming money from the nursing home where she worked. She'd lost everything: her house, her career, her freedom, and her co-conspirator. Jessica had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was living in a trailer park outside Tallahassee, working at a convenience store and trying to convince people she was the victim of a vindictive ex-husband. No one believed her, but it didn't matter. She was no longer my problem. I used some of Dad's money to establish a scholarship fund in his name for kids who wanted to learn automotive repair but couldn't afford trade school. I used some more to quietly help families in our old neighborhood who were struggling with medical bills or job loss. But mostly I just lived, I learned to cook the meals Dad had loved. I restored the vintage cars he'd collected and hidden in a garage I'd never known existed. I traveled to places he'd always wanted to visit but never could because he'd been too busy protecting his family and building their future. And every evening I sat in his chair in his real living room, surrounded by photos of a man who'd been so much more than I'd ever imagined, and I felt grateful. Not for the money he'd left me, though it had given me choices I'd never had before. Not for the revenge I'd been able to exact on the people who'd betrayed us both, though justice had its own satisfaction. I felt grateful for the lesson he'd spent his lifetime teaching me, that the people who truly love you will sacrifice for your happiness, while the people who pretend to love you will sacrifice you for their own. It had taken 56 years and the loss of everything I thought mattered, but I finally understood the difference. And for the first time in my adult life, I was completely, peacefully free.